a place that promised a new beginning, a schoolhouse nestled among the rolling hills of colonial Rhode Island. Built from the weathered stone of a forgotten time, its name was the Black Briar Schoolhouse, and in the late autumn of 1769, it was supposed to be a beacon of learning. Instead, it became a tomb. This isn't a story of ghost whispers or campfire legends. It's a chilling historical account of an event so terrifying, so baffling, that it was erased from the official records. What happened inside those walls? What was the lesson that no child survived to tell? This is the story of a place where knowledge met its end, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream. It's a tale that proves some doors of history should have stayed locked. Before we step back in time and unlock this grim mystery, I've got a quick favor to ask. If you're into the darker, more unsettling corners of history like this, please hit that like button to show your support. And if you're not already part of our community, make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell on, so you don't miss our next deep dive into the unknown. Before it became a symbol of a historical horror, the Black Briar Schoolhouse was simply a place of hope. Picture it. The year is 1769, and in the quiet green hills of colonial Rhode Island, a new schoolhouse has just opened its doors. It's a small stone structure, built by the local community, with a single large hearth to keep the children warm during the long New England winters. Sunlight streams through its single pane of glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a sign of life and learning. The name Black Briar came not from anything sinister, but from the thorny, dark vines that grew wild on the property. It was a charming, rustic detail that spoke to the isolation of the place. This was a community of farmers and tradesmen, hardy folk who believed in hard work and the promise of a better future for their children. To them, the schoolhouse was a Bacuna place where their sons and daughters would learn to read and write, to do sums, and to find their place in a world that was rapidly changing. On an ordinary autumn morning, a dozen children between the ages of 6 and 11 walked the familiar paths to the schoolhouse. They carried their slates, their books, and their dreams. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of color, and everything seemed perfectly normal. They were just kids, ready for a day of lessons, blissfully unaware of the darkness that was about to descend. Their teacher, a young woman named Alara Croft, was known for her kindness and her quiet dedication. She was well-liked and respected by the parents, who trusted her with the most precious thing they had. The Black Briar Schoolhouse was, for all intents and purposes, a safe haven, a microcosm of the world the community was trying to build, a world of peace, order, and progress. But as we'll soon discover, even the most secure places can become sites of unimaginable terror. Something was coming for the children of Black Briar, something that would turn this pastoral scene into a haunting memory. And when the sun set on that fateful day, the only lesson learned was one of fear, silence, and the chilling realization that some endings have no explanation. To understand what happened at Black Briar, we have to look beyond the quaint stone walls and into the world of 1769. It was a time of immense tension. The American colonies were a simmering pot of discontent. On the brink of boiling over into revolution, Rhode Island, in particular, was a hotbed of political defiance, famous for its resistance to British taxation and control. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, these weren't just abstract laws. They were a daily reality, a source of anger and friction between colonists and the crown. But it wasn't just a political divide. There were ideological rifts as well. Tensions ran high between those who remained loyal to King George and those who were leaning toward independence. Neighbors who had known each other for a lifetime suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a debate that felt like it was tearing the very fabric of society apart. These were the undercurrents swirling beneath the calm surface of rural life. While the children of Black Briar were learning their alphabet, the adults were learning the first, painful lessons of rebellion and division. It's tempting to think of this schoolhouse as completely isolated from the outside world, a protected bubble of innocence. But in a small community, a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, those tensions inevitably seeped in. The teacher, Alara Croft, was rumored to be from a family with loyalist sympathies, a fact that didn't sit well with some of the more firebrand patriots in the area. And though it was never spoken of openly, there were rumors of feuds over land and debts that ran deep within the community, hidden just beneath the surface of neighborly pleasantries. Were these tensions enough to explain what happened? Probably not on their own. But they created an atmosphere, a sense of unease that was present long before the tragedy struck. They set the stage for a story where the lines between political conflict, personal animosity, and sheer unexplainable horror would become blurred. So, while the children were happily reciting their lessons, the world outside was already teaching them a far more brutal one, and it was about to walk right through their schoolhouse door. That fateful morning in late October began, like any other. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. The children of Black Briar arrived at the schoolhouse, their boots kicking up rust-colored leaves as they went. The school day unfolded with familiar rhythm. Lessons in arithmetic, the reading of the Bible, and the scratch of slate pencils. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The last person to see the schoolhouse from a distance was a local farmer, Silas Green, who was tending his crops nearby. He would later recall seeing the smoke from the chimney, a comforting plume against the autumn sky. He saw nothing else. Inside, the day proceeded as planned. It's easy to imagine the scene. A dozen young faces, some bright-eyed and eager, others squirming in their seats, dreaming of the afternoon's freedom. Teacher Alara Croft would have been at her desk, perhaps mending a quill or preparing the next lesson. The last moments of normalcy were filled with the quiet sounds of learning, the rustle of papers, the soft drone of a voice reading aloud, the familiar creak of the floorboards. But at some point, the sound stopped. There was no struggle, no cries for help, no panicked rush from the building. The smoke from the chimney would have continued to rise, giving no hint of the silent terror that had befallen the occupants. It was a stillness so profound that it went unnoticed. The schoolhouse simply, went quiet. The last moments before the silence are the most terrifying part of this story. What kind of event could have seized a dozen children and their teacher without a single sound, without a single witness? It wasn't until late that afternoon, when parents began to arrive to collect their children, that the chilling truth began to emerge. They found the door ajar, an ominous sign in a community where doors were always latched. A lantern still burned on a table inside, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The first parent to arrive was a man named Thomas Abernathy, a local blacksmith, who had come to fetch his son, Samuel. He found the door unlatched, which was strange, but his heart didn't begin to pound until he stepped inside. The air was cold, despite the still warm hearth. The room was perfectly neat, with slates still resting on desks, a book open to a lesson on a table, and a half-mended quill on Alara Croft's desk. It was a picture of orderly learning, but it was completely and utterly devoid of life. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, not a single drop of blood. The discovery sent a shockwave through the small community. Soon, a frantic search party was formed, comprised of fathers, mothers, and neighbors. Armed with lanterns and a desperate hope, they scoured the woods and the paths leading away from the schoolhouse, calling out the children's names into the encroaching twilight. But the only answers they received were the cold echoes of their own voices. The search yielded nothing. There were no footprints leaving the schoolhouse, no torn pieces of clothing, no signs of a struggle on the forest floor. The most unsettling discovery was inside the schoolhouse itself. On a small table, neatly stacked, were the personal belongings of the children. A small wooden toy horse belonging to young William, a ribbon from Mary's hair, even a small coin that had been in a boy's pocket. It was as if each child had been asked to put their most cherished possessions on display before they vanished. Who would do this, and why? This detail was the most baffling of all, turning a simple disappearance into something far more sinister and incomprehensible. The event, which would soon be known as the Black Briar incident, became the subject of wild speculation. Could it have been an attack by a rival native tribe, an act of political violence, or something far more otherworldly? The community's fear turned into a frantic, chaotic hunt for answers. But the more they searched, the more the mystery deepened. The schoolhouse stood as a silent, grim monument to a terrifying question. How could a dozen people simply cease to exist? The only thing they knew for sure was that the Black Briar Schoolhouse held its secrets close, and it wasn't giving them up easily. The official response to the Black Briar incident was both swift and baffling. A small group of local authorities, along with a few militia members, launched an investigation. But they were looking for a crime that had no physical evidence. How do you investigate a scene with no bodies, no blood, and no signs of a breach? Their search focused on the surrounding area, interviewing local farmers and travelers. But every account led to a dead end. No one saw anything. No one heard a single scream. The authorities were quick to propose a theory, one that would have been more palatable to the community than the terrible reality. They suggested that perhaps a traveling band of renegade loyalists had kidnapped the children to use as leverage against their patriot families. It was a plausible idea given the tense political climate, but it fell apart under scrutiny. There were no ransom notes, no witnesses to a procession of children being led away, and no demands ever came. It was a theory born more out of a desperate need for a logical explanation than from actual evidence. Another theory, quietly put forth, suggested a sudden, localized outbreak of a fast-acting disease, a plague that struck so quickly it left no time for escape. But this, too, had its flaws. A disease would have left bodies, or at least some trace of illness, and nothing was found. The children's possessions, left neatly on the table, also defied this explanation. It was as if they had been meticulously prepared to leave, a final, terrifying ritual before their disappearance. The official investigation eventually stalled and was quietly closed. The records, what few there were sealed or lost. This lack of a resolution created a void, and as we know, voids are quickly filled by whispers and speculation. The parents were left to grieve a loss they couldn't even comprehend, and the schoolhouse stood as a grim testament to the town's failure. It was the missing pieces, the things they couldn't explain, that would give rise to the truly unsettling stories, the ones that would be passed down in hushed tones for generations. The silence of Black Briar was deafening, and it was about to give birth to a legend. With the official investigation going nowhere, the community turned to a far more dangerous kind of explanation: folklore. In the absence of facts, the human mind conjures its own truths. Soon, whispered stories began to circulate about the schoolhouse, stories that had less to do with politics and more to do with the supernatural. The most popular tale involved an old, malevolent spirit said to haunt the Black Briar woods. According to the legend, this spirit was a dark force that fed on innocence, and the schoolhouse, built on its territory, was a terrible trespass. Parents who had lost their children swore they heard their names being called on the wind, a sound like a phantom child's voice carrying through the briar patch. Others claimed to see shadowy figures moving in the schoolhouse windows at night, though the building had been abandoned. The logical mind dismisses these as the ravings of grief-stricken parents. But in a world where fear was a constant companion, these stories took on a life of their own. They provided a dark, albeit fantastical, answer to a question no one could logically solve. The most chilling unofficial theory, however, didn't involve spirits or monsters. It suggested something far more human and far more terrifying. This story whispered that the children had been taken, not for ransom or political gain, but as a sacrifice. Some local people clung to old, forgotten beliefs that predated Christianity, and in times of great uncertainty, they would resort to desperate measures. Was it a ritual to ensure a good harvest? To ward off disease? The idea was too horrifying to be spoken of in polite company, but it spread like a virus. It suggested that a group within the community was responsible, that the schoolhouse was a place of dark learning, and that the teacher and children were simply offerings. It's a testament to the community's fear and desperation that such a theory could gain traction. It was a story born of a place where people were terrified and had no one to blame. The rumors painted a grim picture of a society tearing itself apart, where the trust that held it together had dissolved. The Black Briar Schoolhouse was no longer a symbol of hope. It had become a permanent stain on the landscape, a monument to a lesson that was taught in silence, and a mystery that would never truly be solved. The official records may have been erased, but the unofficial story, the terrifying one, was just beginning. For a modern mind, a story like Black Briar begs for a rational explanation. The supernatural tales, while terrifying, don't hold up to scrutiny. So, what are the logical possibilities? The most compelling theory, aside from the flawed political kidnapping idea, is a natural disaster or an environmental event. Perhaps a sudden, silent landslide buried the schoolhouse, a possibility given the hilly terrain of the area, but no such event was recorded, and the building was found intact and standing. Another possibility is a lightning strike or a flash fire, but once again, there was no damage. The idea of a highly contagious, fast-acting illness also has some merit. Something like a swift-moving influenza or a form of bacterial meningitis could have incapacitated a group of people in minutes. But the complete lack of bodies or graves makes this highly unlikely. Where would they have gone? The mystery of the vanishing bodies is what truly separates this story from a mere tragedy and elevates it to the status of a haunting legend. The more we search for a rational answer, the more we find ourselves hitting a wall. One of the most chilling possibilities is that this was a targeted, non-political act. Perhaps a single, unhinged individual with a personal vendetta against the teacher or one of the families was responsible. An attack by an armed individual could have been quick and decisive, but it still doesn't account for the silence. Would no child have screamed? Would no one have run? This theory, while terrifying, is still riddled with holes. The disappearance of all the bodies, in a time when hiding a single body was difficult, seems nearly impossible. This is the great paradox of the Black Briar Schoolhouse. The physical evidence, or lack thereof, pushes us away from a simple, rational solution and forces us to consider the unexplainable. It suggests that whatever happened was not something a simple police report or a scientific inquiry could ever hope to explain. The story challenges our understanding of what is possible, and in doing so, it has endured for centuries. The lesson here is that sometimes, the most logical answer is simply that there isn't one, and that's far more terrifying than any ghost story. The story of the Black Briar Schoolhouse was so effectively erased from official history because it was a narrative no one wanted to tell. It's hard to imagine a community being able to move on from a tragedy of this scale, one with no closure and no clear explanation. The event was a wound that never healed, a painful scar on the collective memory. It was far easier to bury the story, to let it fade into local legend, than to confront the terrifying possibility that such a thing could happen. The official records were lost, perhaps intentionally. No one wanted to be the keeper of a story that suggested such a fundamental failure to protect the community's children. So, the story became something else, a ghost story told in hushed tones. A local myth passed down through generations, stripped of its historical context. The horror became palatable, a frightening tale you could dismiss as mere folklore. But in doing so, we lose the most important lesson of all. The lesson no child survived was a lesson for us all, that the world can be a truly terrifying and unpredictable place. It taught us that even in the most peaceful of settings, darkness can arrive without a sound. It showed us that when an event defies logical explanation, it can haunt a community for centuries, becoming a ghost in its own right. The Black Briar Schoolhouse, long since gone to ruin, is a monument not to a specific crime, but to the fragility of our sense of security. So when you hear a story that seems too strange to be true, ask yourself why it was so important to forget it. What terrifying truth was so difficult to face that it had to be buried? The legend of the Black Briar Schoolhouse is a haunting echo, a reminder that some of history's most important lessons are the ones that never made it into the books. They were written in silence, and the only way to read them is to listen for the whispers of the past.